Hello, everybody. Welcome. We got our technical things fixed up, so thank you very much. I'm Larry, and this is Scott, and I want to have a disclaimer right up front. This was a story in the making for quite a bit of time, and matter of fact, a lot of the build-up to it. I wasn't even in the state doing stormwater at the time. So, and I have an alibi. But Scott's assignment kind of brought us together, and we thought it was a pretty good story for us to share. So we're gonna launch right into it. And it started when I got an email from our permit administrator over at Ecology. It said, "Hey Larry, the environmental assessment program is doing a project and needs your data. How about that?" And I was like, it was an effectiveness data. Not effectiveness data, effectiveness evaluation. We want your data. And so, this was my first introduction to Scott electronically. Sent me this email. We completed a sampling project. We're starting to look at the data. So back at the county, we're like, what could possibly go wrong? So we're like, before we start doling out our data, let's meet with them and kind of see what the intent is here. So this led to our first meeting, and we're going to be going back and forth here.
This is part of one of my lessons learned is don't send emails to Larry. one of many that I learned along this process. So first I'll provide a little background about the projects. Well, I guess I'll provide a little bit of context about the background. This was a Tmdl effectiveness monitoring study that we put together in 2013, 2014 for the Henderson Inlet Watershed. And there was a lot of things unique about this watershed. One, it was in very close proximity of our office. So it's one of those studies that you don't have a lot of travel time to meet or talk with people or actually even to conduct the sampling. So we were able to actually get a lot out of this study to help us evaluate effectiveness. But it's also unique in the fact that it's one of the first studies that we've done, or Tmdls that we've gone back and reassessed that had such a large urban footprint. It covers in the upper watershed the cities of Lacey as well as the City of Olympia. And the two major tributaries to the inlet are Woodland Creek and Woodard Creek, and they both actually originate in the lowlands within the urban growth area. Despite that, most of the streams within Henderson Inlet still have relatively healthy populations of several species of salmon, including coho, snook, and as well as steelhead. So I think that in itself is a unique situation, at least from what I've seen in some other areas. Henderson Inlet is also a productive shell fishery. On average, they harvest approximately 250,000 oysters and clams per year, commercially as well as recreationally. One of the problems that started popping up between '84 and 2000 was the downgrading of shellfish areas within the watershed. And in response to that, most of the fresh waters flowing into the inlet made it on our 303D list for being impaired for bacteria. And I'm assuming most of you are somewhat familiar with the Tmdl process. I've been doing it for a long time. I'm not exactly familiar with it, all the aspects of it, but basically what happened is he was asked to go in and conduct a Tmdl study in the inlet and the freshwater, as well as the marine sections. What the Tmdl study ended up identifying were both bacteria and nutrient issues throughout the watershed. Excuse me. So as part of this Tmdl process, load allocations were set at 21 of these sampling locations throughout the watershed. And once the study was done, the Tmdl implementation plan was put together, which identified a number of projects that needed to be implemented by different stakeholders in the watershed in order to restore waters back to their normal conditions. Since that original listing and since the Tmdl implementation plan, there's been approximately $22 million just in grant and loan funding spent in the watershed to improve water quality. And if you take a look at this map here, this is something that we put together actually going through all of the grant and loan information that was available to us to try to put together a BMP map. So basically these red dots indicate places where BMPs were placed, and the size of the dot indicates its footprint. We assessed a number of different BMP types, from land acquisition to stormwater retrofits to in-stream habitat improvements, as well as agricultural and education outreach and septic-to-sewer projects. So once it was determined that most of the projects that have been outlined in the implementation plan were put in place, our program got a request to go in and basically do follow-up monitoring. And normally what we do is we don't have this implementation data available to us, so it's just a really a snapshot in time. We end up comparing the data that was collected in the original Tmdl study with the data that was collected post-implementation. So what we ended up finding out that actually there was only one of the stations met water quality standards. The remaining 20 stations were still out of compliance with for bacteria. But then when we went back and looked and compared the load allocations, basically it was a % change between 2003 and 2014. We did see improvement in 19 of the 21 stations between the two sampling years. I gotta grab a drink of water. This is the point where I was I started to become more familiar with the county. Thankfully, Thurston County has had a long-term ambient monitoring program in place, not just in the Henderson, but throughout Thurston County. It turned out that Thurston County had been collecting monthly ambient water quality samples at several locations in the watershed going back to 1983. So what this helped us to do was basically to take a different look at what was going on in the watershed, more than just a snapshot in time, but we were able to establish trends over time and basically set up a timeline between when investments occurred and when water quality improvements occurred. And so if you look at this graph at the bottom of the screen here, the lines represent a multilinear regression analysis with both bacteria and nutrients, nitrogen data over the course of 15 to 20 years. And if you look at the points when these lines started tipping over in the downward direction, we get an approximate idea of dates when these occurred. The other thing it allowed us to do is compare our normal way of doing things, the before-after snapshot with long-term trends over time. And one of the things that you notice is this is one example. It's on Sleepy Creek, where our percent change or reductions ended up suggesting that Sleepy Creek was actually getting worse over time, even though we know there was a lot of investment made in the upper watershed. When we sat down and take a look at the data, the trend data versus the before after, we saw two very different stories. The fecal coliform basically was declining significantly based on the county's data. Again, our before after snapshot told us it was getting worse. If you take a look at the red circles on the graph here, these represent the dates when the snapshots were assessed. And a lot of times in the Tmdls, they'll set load allocations based on critical seasons. So in the case for Sleepy Creek, the highest concentrations we were worried about were during the wet season. Again, if you look at when the data was assessed, in 2003, it was assessed at the bottom of that curve, and then again in 2014, it was assessed near the top. And basically when it was conditions were worse. So I mean this is something that we saw at two of the four locations where we had overlap. And then basically this is just sort of a roll-up of some of the take-home messages we got. There was a lot more work involved in how we came up with these numbers, and I'm not going to go into. We have a final report that's published on a web, but what we did is we sat down and we looked at the data in relation to the water quality data in relation to the implementation data, and asked ourselves a number of questions. One was the Tmdl water quality cleanup plan effective? If you think about it in terms of getting things done, 72% of the actions that were outlined in the implementation plan were implemented. 100% of the high priority items identified in the implementation plan were implemented. Almost immediately after the water quality cleanup plan was published, project funding in the area went up by 77%. All the major sources that were identified in the original Tmdl study were corrected, and we saw bacteria and nutrients decline throughout the entire watershed. Stormwater projects were another big investment that was made in the watershed. One of the things that we noticed right off the bat that we were only able to collect water quality samples from a handful of sites. Basically, the outfalls were not discharging as they were when the original study was done. We would go back after a certain rain event, and a certain amount of rain fell, and these outfalls were dry. So, I mean, to me, that tells me that whatever was done as far as stormwater retrofits were having a positive effects, at least from keeping stormwater from entering the streams. In addition, we saw bacteria and nutrient concentrations decline below the project's in-stream, and as well as coming out of the outfalls based on the county's data. We had one large septic-to-sewer project where I believe it was 150 septic systems were taken offline, and that waste was moved into the central sewer line. This was in a 40-acre area that bordered Woodland Creek. And they were estimating basically 30,000 gallons a day of septic water was removed from the system, which seems to me to be a win, regardless of what the results show. But in this case, we ended up seeing bacteria and nitrogen go down in stream below this project after it was implemented. Planning was another big investment that was made in the grants, based on the water quality grants. And basically, there was one project in particular that seemed to stick out as being effective, in which the county had hired a contractor to use the data collected by the Tmdl study as well as the county's data to create a model basically to prioritize projects in the watershed based on cost. So they implemented the projects where they got the most bang for their buck. Some of the projects that were difficult to assess for us were the septic system inspection program for the watershed, education and outreach activities, in addition to agricultural BMPs. And mainly the septic and agricultural BMPs were difficult to assess because we weren't able to get a hold of any actual data as far as what was implemented or when it was implemented. And I think that's...
So a couple of points I want to emphasize. And at first meeting with Scott, there was a trust and rapport that was really built up that allowed the county, do we have to do that, Amy? Come on. that allowed the county to have faith in the evaluation process. And Scott, he was genuine researcher, didn't come into it with seeming like a predetermined outcome, and that made a big difference for us. So I just wanted to point that out. And another thing that struck home that I want to emphasize is the traditional methodology for Tmdl effectiveness, if we didn't have all this data, would have concluded a very different story. $22 million invested and it didn't do anything. By happen chance, and it wasn't by design, the county didn't start collecting data in '83 saying, oh, we're gonna have a 3D list and we're gonna have an effectiveness study. This is gonna, help us out. It was luck, it wasn't by design. So I just wanted to point that out. So they did, part of the first meeting, Scott's like, well, we're gonna do our report and then we're gonna give you an opportunity if you want to review and comment on it. And so there was all kinds of conclusions and findings. And the one that I honed in on really quick was, long-term monitoring program was essential to support their conclusions. Oh, well, that was nice. Recommendation, continuing Thurston County long-term monitoring program. And there was a reason for my panic. So another email I saved. Scott was kind of curious about this one comment that we sent, and I want to give you a little bit of background. Any of you attend the previous session on the RSMP or the SAM type of thing? Okay, well, these stories are related. So we have a regional monitoring partnership too, and it was established in 91, or I've heard maybe going back to 89. And it was in partnership with the local cities of Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, and jointly funded by the county and the cities for the same. Wow, how progressive, way back when. And they had different program elements that grew over the years. stream flow participation, lake and groundwater levels, ambient water quality monitoring, macroinvertebrate, special projects. Those were specific of local effectiveness projects or characterizing a particular outfall. One of them was an outfall from DOT, and that led to a retrofit project. QA, QC, data management, reporting, program administration, standard stuff. And you know what? We got together and funded this because there was utility for us. We got a lot of use. There's good cost benefit. You know, we used it for land use watershed planning. You know, our planners liked it. Policy development. You know, adaptive management. It was helpful for targeting our programs and our capital facility projects. Evaluated effectiveness at different levels, at the project level, at the basin level. Evaluating trends, changes, biological health. All sorts of stuff. This is a snapshot of the funding on our local program over time. You know, it started out in the beginning, you know, just under 80,000, and then it grew quite a bit, you know, at its peak, and then we had a significant drop off. We had a significant event, and there was a, you know, if we did the correlation with a chi-square or whatever, there was a strong correlation between having to pay into the regional monitoring program for the RSMP as part of our permit, and the resources we ended up with for our local effort. There just simply was not enough funding resources to support both. So, you know, out of compliance or, you know, cut the local funding program. Oop, I hit the wrong button. So just quick picture. This is a snapshot of collectively how much our local jurisdictions have to pay in to meet the permits monitoring requirement. You know, over $106,000. Oh, those were annual, and this is annual too. So we just couldn't absorb that. So that was financial impacts, which resulted in programmatic impacts locally. It certainly was a destabilization of our funding for our program, a 44% reduction from the previous 5-year agreement. That was a big hit. Questions emerged regarding the program's long-term viability. We had to reduce the number of monitoring stations. We eliminated the macroinvertebrate monitoring and special projects completely. Annual reporting went to biannual, and they even cut out the paper copies. You know, we're just going electronic. So, you know, and it resulted in a break in continuous long-term data record, and, you know, Scott got really sad. You know, we built him up with all this stuff, and then it's like, when the comment is like, well, Scott, I think there's something you should know. And he goes, oh, that's why that, what was it, 2013 data just, it wasn't there? Was that? So.
I thought you were saving money.
We were, but we're sending it to you guys. Scott never experienced a presentation with me before. This is I warned him in advance of my warped sense of humor. So this is some looking forward stuff. This is, Scott and I would have great one-on-one conversations. It would have been fun to video the conversation. We had interesting dialogues. Scott, you know, one of the things I found is he gave me a warning when I mentioned this. He goes, you know, I was kind of involved in helping the RSMP early on in setting up the design and so forth, because I was kind kind of a little bit pissy about losing all the money for the local program. So he was giving me fair warning. But anyway, in coming together, these are some of the things we saw that we could do on a smaller scale that's tougher to do on a larger scale. I mean, when you're in closer proximity, it's easier to detect the responses, and it's faster. So the larger you go out, the less resolution you have with your monitoring stations and your data. It makes things tougher. The feedback loops aren't there. And sitting down with Scott, he was reflecting that there's this really artificial separation of stats and trends and effectiveness, source ID monitoring. It really doesn't have to be. It's like he used to describe it. Monitoring is monitoring. If you put stats and trends and effectiveness combined, or stats and trends and source ID could help you with your PIC program. We need to really look at this in a more integrated fashion, of which Scott in his effectiveness analysis really was able to do. I'm not sure at the RSMP SAM level that they're really thinking about how to integrate those different types of monitoring to use in the various ways. I think they're getting tired of me.
I think you talked over my slide.
Yeah, well.
That's okay. Basically, I think one of the things that I noticed is we don't get to look at the scales of effectiveness like this. Ecology has a very limited monitoring program. It's set up for large spatial scale designs. Coming into a watershed and having a data set that's so rich, it allows you to do a lot more. One of the things that we do during our assessments is we not only try to look at the data as we're collecting it, but we also we react to it. So if we have a high hit, we respond to it by bracket sampling. If it's near an area that we think we can source ID, we'll put in and use different technologies to try to identify sources, such as optical brightener probes. We're looking at nitrogen isotopes in the algae to give us indication of leaky septic. So we try to get as much as we can out of 1 year of study before moving on. Very rarely do we have a data set where we can look at long-term trends, and it makes a huge difference, and it could potentially, I think, save people a lot of money over time. But that being said, there aren't a lot of counties throughout the state that have monitoring programs like this. This map is basically, apologize if your county is not on here, but this is my limited knowledge of some of the monitoring programs that have existed. The green dots are our long-term ambient monitoring network. If you take that and you overlay that with the Tmdl areas that we have in the state, the state, are not going to be able to assess trends in this way at this level. It really does come down to the local monitoring effort. and however the Henderson got set up, and it quite possibly could be because it's so small, it worked. The monitoring they had in place worked, it did the job. I think some of the downfalls of maybe having that data is people don't have time to look at it. I mean, we run into the same situations. We have a lot of data coming in, and we don't have enough time to do due diligence to look at the data and make these connections. And I think that's it.